can start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, the third of our lectures in the series. This series, in fact, we're really lucky because on the first night we had the Dean of our law school. Second night we had one of the prominent practitioners from the Johannesburg Bar, and now we've switched from academics to prominent practitioners to very prominent members or ex-members of the Constitutional Court. It's really great pleasure and honour to introduce to you Justice Zach Koob, who's had a very long and distinguished career. And in fact, I was thinking about it that one of the first times I met Justice Koob was in the early 1980s at a conference about basically engaging with the question of law in the early 1980s, run by somebody who now is in Australia, Andy Durbach. We were both much younger men then. I wondered then, I suppose, whether we ever thought, you or I, that one, you'd be elevated to the Constitutional Court and that I'd even get to become a judge of the High Court. Possibly the former, not the latter, was probably more likely. But the fact of the matter is that Justice Koob was somebody who had a very long and impressive and deeply committed role in the struggle, both as a member of the Natal Indian Congress during the 1980s, also because of a very committed practice as a counsel, a senior counsel, member of the legal team in the famous treason trial cases that took place during the 1980s, and then finally, and quite properly, in 1998, appointed as a Justice of the Constitutional Court of South Africa, from which he's recently retired. Apart from anything else, apart from all of that, many of the judgments that he penned over this particular period are really critical. The one that, for obvious reasons, I like, because I was the judge at the Court Quo, and although they did, in fact, take a totally different reasoning to mine, was the famous Grootboom case. And if you read that judgment, as one does as a judge of the High Court when one is confronted with socio-economic rights, that, to my mind, still remains the high watermark of our jurisprudence on socio-economic rights, and I will talk a little bit about that case and its promise on Friday night. But it's really a great pleasure to welcome you, Zach. Thank you for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dennis, and for those words of introduction. Do I need the microphone, or can you hear me? Okay, great. So we have a constitution in our country. It's been around. The values of our constitution have been around for 22 years. You must not forget that. It was in 1994, as some of you who were here 2 days ago would have known, that the interim constitution came into effect. But we have a constitution in our country. And I want to start by talking about one debate which has been had in many legal circles, and particularly in the United States, and that is the theory of original intent. Theory of original intent says that you go back to what the Constitution makers actually thought when they made the Constitution in order to determine what the Constitution means. There's another different point of view which adopts the approach that original intent is not a good idea, because that means that in a constitution adopted in 1850, when you interpret it in 2050, you interpret it in accordance with the values of 200 years ago, and 200 years ago in America were the values of slavery and inequality and oppression of women and all those sorts of things, ultimately. And therefore, if you want a dynamic constitution, if you want a constitution which can be interpreted in terms of the order of the day, then the constitution must have a life of its own. A life absolutely of its own, which has little to do with the intention of the makers of the Constitution, but which has more to do with what the Constitution, with its own life, means. And the duty of courts is to breathe life into the Constitution to make sure that this happens. And the breathing of life into the Constitution involves context. And that is why I am going to start with apartheid, which is the context which we bear in mind when we interpret our Constitution. Don't want to say too much about it, but clearly you know that we had the evil of apartheid in our country. We had the evil of inequality. We had the evil of sexual inequality. We had the evil of disrespect for all people who were not white. We had much trauma, much difficulty, much violence in our country. And basically, the new constitution came into effect in 1994 because both the sides had to negotiate in order to work out some deal. For as far as the government, and we must remind ourselves, this was not somebody who had the good heart of the people in the country. It wasn't that the National Party suddenly realized that its policies were all wrong. It wasn't that they suddenly began to believe that African people were truly human beings and that they were wrong in what they were doing. The reason why we had the Constitution is that on the one hand, the Nats could not govern because the people had declared that they would render the country ungovernable, and there were great chances that they were going to succeed. The reason we had the new constitution is that the international community gave the oppressors in this country no option but to make sure that something was done. And the other reason was that because of the significant might of the military machine of this country, there was no choice but for the ANC also and the forces of liberation to negotiate, because an absolute conquest at that time seemed extremely unlikely, and time was in fact running out. So in a sense, it was those balance of forces which existed at the time which determined what our constitution actually was. There are many criticisms of the way in which our constitution has been drafted, and we'll talk about some of those things as we go along. But really it was those balance of forces. The ANC couldn't get exactly what it wanted. The Nats couldn't get exactly what they wanted. But the most important point of departure was that the forces of liberation, in the context of an argument by the Nationalist Party, having been guilty of the policy of out-and-out minoritarianism, they had the impertinence, in my view, to suggest at the time that what we don't want is out-and-out majoritarianism. And that plea was well heeded by the forces of liberation, and we came to the conclusion that we will have constitutionalism in our country. And it's important to understand that concept of constitutionalism as a qualification of majoritarianism. In other words, we decided in 1994 that it was not the majority in Parliament from time to time who will be able to do precisely what they wanted, as is the case in many a country in this world. We decided in our country that we would qualify majoritarianism and that there'd be certain things which the majority parliament would not be able to do. There are many things that the Constitution, of course, can be amended by a two-thirds majority, but the principles of our Constitution, the principles of equality, democracy, and separation of powers and so on, can, and they are set out in section 1 of the Constitution, if you need to look at them, can only be changed if you have a 75% majority. So there is an element of majoritarianism, but majoritarianism has been qualified, and there are certainly now Parliament and everyone needs to comply with the Constitution, and it's important for us all to recognize this, to recognize the importance of the Constitution, to recognize the difference between constitutional supremacy and parliamentary supremacy. One man that does understand it, if you've been reading these newspapers, is a man called Jimmy Manley. He goes by a different name now, but I don't want to accord him that degree of respect to try and pronounce his other name. But let's leave that for those. What he has said, though, is that we must revert to a parliamentary democracy. That it is the constitutionalism, it is the constitutional democracy which is the cause of the absence of reconstruction in our country. Now people may get worried about this, but don't worry too much, because ultimately Manley can go on talking as much as he likes. The idea, the notion of getting even in the unforeseeable future, a 75% majority to get rid in our country of the principles of our constitution gets bleaker and bleaker as time goes on. So there is reason to be comfortable about it. So the first important thing one must bear in mind is that Parliament is not supreme in our country, that no Parliament will be supreme. It is the Constitution which is supreme, and all of us must begin to know this, and all of us must begin to understand this. The second important thing about our Constitution is that in a constitutional democracy, it is not about voting every 5 years and that being the end of that. Our democracy now has a moral content. It has a value content. It has a value content which looks at balancing dignity, equality, and freedom, which looks at the separation of powers between different forms of government, different arms of government, the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, as something which is very important. And more importantly, it values a large number of fundamental rights, which I will not detail here, which define in an interesting way the nature of our society. And that is an important thing which we need to understand. And against that background, I want to talk about the separation of powers a little bit. So our Constitution makes it very clear that the Constitution is supreme, that all law or conduct inconsistent with it is invalid. And once you have a system of that kind, where the Constitution itself says that all law or conduct inconsistent with it is invalid, you must have a system by which to work out whether law or conduct in a particular situation is inconsistent with the Constitution or not. So it is the Constitution, in the way in which it is framed, which determines the nature of the separation of powers in our country. So the separation of powers is not a static principle. It's not the principle which is the same as time goes on. It is the context which determines the separation of powers, but the nature of the separation of powers between the different arms of government is determined by the nature of the constitution you have in your country. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But let's go to what the separation of powers was like before 1994. In 1994, before 1994, there was an absolute separation of powers between the executive and the legislature on the one hand and the judiciary on the other. Of course, whether there is or will ever be a true separation of powers between the executive and the legislature is another question which we might think about sometime, but which I will not go into now. The issue really is the separation of powers between the legislature and the executive on the one hand and the judiciary on the other. There was an absolute separation of powers in those days with our constitutional setup before 1994. And there was, as courts very often said, no bridge between law and justice in our country in those days. A law could be as unjust as it pleased. A law could discriminate, could be unequal, do exactly what it wanted, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Courts had to enforce laws, whether they regarded them as just or not. And the theme was that it was the legislature that made the law, and it was the duty of the courts to enforce it. Now that has changed considerably, because there is a body which must determine whether to enforce the law or not, whether a law is consistent with the Constitution or not, and it is the courts which determine that. Courts have no discretion in that regard. Courts are obliged to declare inconsistent with the Constitution law or conduct that is inconsistent with the Constitution. They have no choice whatsoever. The Constitution obliges courts to do that. And it does not matter whose conduct it is. You hear a great deal about policy issues which must be decided by the political arena and so on. And yet it is our Constitution. You see, political people can talk as much as they like. But when political policy decisions result in conduct, that conduct, whether it is the result of a political policy decision or not, must be measured and is always measurable in terms of the Constitution. And therefore, we must not get away with the fact that policy decisions somehow require courts to take a somewhat different attitude in relation to constitutional questions. So our Constitution has greatly impacted upon the separation of powers by the way in which it is drafted. The separation of powers question, the debate in this country is very different from the debate in any other country. The debate here is about courts having the power to declare something inconsistent with the Constitution. Now, of course, because values are involved, and of course, because adjudication, any adjudication, is not a mechanical issue, and of course, because judges, as we heard yesterday, are human beings, and to a degree, judges can't go beyond their own humanity. But I want to say something about that, because that is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people say that neutrality and objectivity is perhaps an important ingredient of judicial independence and impartiality. I would disagree, because in judging, judges judge human beings and the life of humanity. And therefore, it is important that they bring their humanity into it. It is important that they do not pretend to be objective. Absolute objectivity is a myth anyway. And then when judges pretend to be objective, you tend to become more over-subjective without knowing it. So a level of humanity, a level of subjectivity is both inevitable and necessary in the judging process, particularly in a constitutional state. And because this is necessary, and because it is inevitable, there will obviously be differences of opinion between judges even about the way in which particular cases should be decided. Of course, there is a right. Some writers have adopted the approach that judging cases in terms of constitutional values gives rise to considerable uncertainty because nobody knows exactly what the law is going to be. But if you read the law reports before 1994, you will find that lawyers have always made money because there was never certainty. The law reports before 1994 are absolutely replete with differences of opinion between judges about how things ought to be decided from time immemorial, whether the Constitution existed or not. So difference of opinion is inevitable. And what we've decided in our country is that the final decider of what is right, whether somebody is acting in accordance with the Constitution or not, is the Constitutional Court. It is a system. We have 11 judges. They are all picked differently. The idea is to make sure that the judges come from different walks of lives and bring their own experiences into the question. And we've got to accept that discipline. Because there's no absolute right or wrong in these issues. And therefore, all of us, particularly lawyers, need to accept the discipline that for the time being, what the majority of the Constitutional Court says is right. And it is not only lawyers who have to accept that discipline. I want to say to you that I have had to accept that discipline too, because I've often been in the minority, and then I've had to write a judgment on the same topic 6 or 8 months later, and I have had to accept the discipline that my judgment was wrong and that the majority judgment was absolutely right. But that is how this constitutional adjudication works. I wanted to make that very clear, that judging in our constitutional order is a very difficult and complicated process which we need to understand. But the discipline is we have accepted the situation in our country that the majority of the Constitutional Court will finally decide these issues. The difficulty with that, of course, is that issues take a long time to determine. Sometimes cases take a long time to get to the Constitutional Court, and many people have asked the question, Why doesn't the Constitutional Court hear matters on its own, immediately, instead of waiting for all other courts to decide it and so on? We've made a decision that we need to develop a jurisprudence which is infused with constitutional values at every level of the court system of our country. For that to happen, all courts need to adjudicate on constitutional issues. And in order to develop a fine and fair jurisprudence, it is the involvement of all courts which is important. The reason why judgments of higher courts are necessary, quite often of a higher quality, sometimes they're not, but they are often of a higher quality than the judgments of other courts. And that is not because the judges of the Constitutional Court or the highest courts of the country are necessarily better at their work. They are sometimes better, but not necessarily. The reason why judgments of higher courts, in my view, are better is really because the matter has been debated previously. There are judgments of other courts to which the higher courts have access. They can look at these things carefully and work that out because the debate has advanced considerably. So I thought we should begin to understand that all the judges in our country have made a contribution to the development of our constitutional jurisprudence, and we should not, of course, begin to think that it is the Constitutional Court which has done particular wonders. It has to a degree, but all judges have contributed, and it is extremely important. But the importance of the courts gives rise to the dangerous thinking, in my view, that the law is perhaps the most important weapon in the struggle of our society to achieve equality, to achieve dignity, to achieve true humanity. And the first thing that must be said in that regard is that the Constitution, by its sheer writing, did not bring about equality and justice in our country. What it did was created the platform, created the wherewithal through which our society could be transformed and improved considerably. And whether we like it or not, if we remember apartheid as it was, there can be all kinds of debate about courts being right and courts being wrong, governments being right, governments being wrong. We can talk a great deal about the unkindlas of this world and the corruption in our country, which is obviously very bad. But we have to concede that this country today has a different feel, has a different take to what it was before 1994. And many of you, I think, are old enough to remember that. It is for our younger people to begin to understand it, and it's very difficult for them to understand. When you walk around the streets of Cape Town, you sometimes get the idea that we are still in the pre-1994 era, but that's a slightly different approach. If you walk in the streets of Johannesburg, you walk in the streets of Durban, or even Bloemfontein, you see that this country has changed. Our values are different. We've really become an African country in a sense, and we must not underestimate that. We must not underestimate the fact that the Constitution has given rise to considerable change in our country and that we live in a different country. But the problem, as I said, is that law is not the only way to achieve change. And I suppose part of the trouble is that we have had to go to the courts a little too often. But there is a difference. You see, our Constitution proclaims equality. And yet, many people, the vast majority of people in our view, white people think that they are superior to African people at one level or another. African people think that they are superior to white people at one level or another. And therefore, this concept of absolute equality and absolute humanity of each of us is accepted, I would say, by a kind of elite club to which I would imagine if out of the 55 million people in our country, we had 100,000 or 200,000 people who truly understood equality, we'd be very lucky. So the vast majority of people still believe in their superiority, but more importantly, a large number of women believe that men are superior. A large number of black people believe that whites are superior. There's a great deal of debate in this country about lawyering and black lawyers getting more work and so on from the corporate sector, and how difficult it is for women lawyers to get more work and so on. And yet all of you remember, and everybody laughed at him, Julius Malema said that he goes to a white lawyer actually, because he thinks that white lawyers are better. That is not a joke at all. It is serious. Many black corporates go to white lawyers. Cyril Ramaphosa goes to a white lawyer when he has to appear before the Marikana Commission. In fact, a whole troop of them. So to a large degree, we, despite our constitution, are our own oppressors. So the Constitutional Court talks about equality, talks about a whole range of things of that sort, and yet, in our heart of hearts, we are different. The problem is that there is a private justice system in our country, the thing that we talk about around our own dinner tables, and there's the public aspect. And it is fashionable publicly for all of us to say we are all non-racial and so on. Not only is it fashionable, it benefits you publicly to be able to say that in many, many different ways. And yet, it's what people talk about at their own dinner tables would show actually what the troubles really are. And I don't know about you guys, and maybe I move around circles which are really very bad circles, but I have been at many a dinner table at which the conversation left a great deal to be desired, and at which I had to do a great deal of work. And that is why a judge would make a racist comment on Facebook, because the judge would think wrongly, or rightly or wrongly, that it's private. So it's this bridge. We must learn in our private lives to live lives of non-racialism and equality, and that's the problem. It's not courts. The Constitutional Court has said that gay and lesbian people should be able to get married, that they are equal to everybody else, that homosexualism is a crime, and yet it shouldn't be a crime if it's consensual, and yet 99% of the people in our country, or the vast majority of people in our country, believe, despite what the courts have said, that gay and lesbian people live in sin. So we need more than the courts. We need more than the law. The law is a very important weapon to achieve change in our country, no doubt about it. But cases need to be more carefully chosen, because what we need is a social revolution. We need a revolution which arises from people knowing and understanding the Constitution. How many of us here have read the Bill of Rights, have internalized it, know its 39, 40 clauses, know what it says, understand its values? How many of us here have truly embraced the values of our Constitution? How many of us here have committed to achieving the values of our Constitution, firstly, by living those values in our daily lives, secondly, by persuading other people to live those values? In my view, our Constitution places an obligation on each and every one of us in this country to contribute towards achieving its vision, not merely by talking about it, but by doing things about it. Not merely by going to courts, because court judgments are there. What we need to do is to ensure the change in the hearts and minds of our people, so that we can build a truly non-racial, non-sexist society. In my view, our Constitution imposes upon us an obligation to do those things, and we have to ensure that we do it. We've got to start getting down to brass tacks. The Constitution is not there for the courts. I have very often said at universities, at many universities, and I hope that today there'll be a change in UCT as a result of what I say. The Bill of Rights is a short document. It should be part of the orientation course of every university, not only for law students, but for every student to understand the Bill of Rights of our country. And I'm sure that judges in Cape Town and judges everywhere will make themselves available to talk to university students about the Constitution so that they begin to learn it. The Bill of Rights, so that they begin to learn it. Nobody's interested in how Parliament takes its decisions and how many members of Parliament there'd be and how the Fiscal and Financial Commission works and so on. We're talking about laws relating to dignity, equality and freedom, which all of us have got to begin to learn, all of us have got to begin to understand, all of us have got to begin to internalize. And that is where, when we talk about the separation of powers, we should be talking about our own power to change our own lives. And in a sense, what we must not forget is that this racism and sexism thing, and this bias against gay and lesbian people and that kind of thing is a worldwide phenomenon. You know, I have to say that there are many people in the Indian community from whom I come, and in many African communities too, where I know people, who are happy when their son marries a fair bride. Somehow it becomes important to them, and that is a level at which we need to change. I want to end by saying, and I'll take questions, which may be a little more technical, but I want to say that we've gone a long way. South Africa has a different feel. You know, in the old days, we used to, if you go to an airport, there'd be only white people there serving you behind the counter. You go to a restaurant to eat, there'd be mainly white people there. The waiters would mainly be white. They'd be Indian in Durban, of course. But that's a slightly different issue. Now things are different. We see that African people have taken ownership of our country. They are everywhere. We have become a truly African nation, and things have changed considerably in our country. I must address the property clause. It was a tightly negotiated clause. It was difficult to negotiate at the time, and the balance of forces had a great deal to do with it. But ultimately, it was the best job that could be done. We had to make a choice between the way in which we do it, and I can talk about it a little bit more if you want to. But I want to say that it was the tightly negotiated clause, and the idea that the property clause could not contribute towards transformation of our country is not one that is acceptable. Of course, I think Dennis will remember that we spent days and days finalizing that property clause. We spent days and days defining a system by which people will be compensated on the expropriation of property for public benefit. We took a long time determining that market value is no longer going to be the ingredient. And Section 25 of our Constitution, that part of it is carefully drafted to ensure just contribution, taking into account a whole range of factors. And you know what? Our government did nothing to change the expropriation law for the first 22 years. They continued to pay market value for the property which they bought. The attempt is now being made to change the law, and one doesn't actually know why it actually took so long. So there is a problem. The Constitution is being forgotten by many. It's not in the hearts and minds of everybody. I wonder sometimes even whether our members of Parliament know what the Bill of Rights says, if we ask them. I wonder how many civil servants know what the Bill of Rights says. So I would simply end by saying that the law is not all. We have to start a process by which we change the hearts and minds of our people, by which we ensure that all of us embrace constitutional values, that all of us live by example, that everyone gets educated in relation to those values, so that if I speak to you in 20 years' time, I can say to you that 10% more of our population believe in constitutional values and are able to live them. If we can increase in the next 10 years the number of people that truly live our constitutional values by 10%, I think we'd have done very, very well. It's going to be a long, hard, and difficult struggle if we are to ensure that many of us in our country live those values, that we don't just talk about it, and that we do not belong with our ideas to a club of elites who believe certain things which the majority of people don't truly believe in. We've got to make sure that we make this change, and I ask all of you to, in real life, contribute towards the process of making this happen as quickly as possible. So now we can have some questions. Dennis will point to the people. Just ask the questions carefully. Speak loudly, because the hearing aids sometimes don't work too well, right? Yeah.
Take a question. Yes, Professor Andrew. You're entitled to ask the first question.
I'm very interested in this idea of internalizing superiority and superiority both with respect to race as well as gender. I think that's the most difficult issue, as you say. The Constitution is a wonderful document, but in order for us to make the Constitution really meaningful, we need to change so much about the way we do things. And you said it, women internalize inferiority in ways that really gets in the way of equality. So beyond education, which is so obvious, how else does one address this issue? Because I can see at the university, the student protest often at universities are frustrated. They don't have a way of expressing some of the sentiments around their own sense of racial inferiority. I know it's a huge question, but this is how I'm going to try.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have to confront it, don't we? In a way, we've been proceeding as if the Constitution has brought it all here, and things are okay, and so on. And we've not confronted these questions. I mean, the Equality Court can do its thing. You can convict people for doing wrong things, but convicting people doesn't really help. You've got to find a way of changing it. And I must say this, I think that I found the process of becoming a non-racialist and non-sexist myself extremely difficult. It was very easy to talk about it because it was fashionable to do so. I had a sense of my own superiority, unfortunately, which was there and which came in the way. And I had to work very hard at it. And for me, I was biased against gay and lesbian people too when I was at university. And I had to confront it, work it through, and deal with it. And I must make the other admission that the sexism within me was perhaps the hardest to counter. So all of us have to start by being honest with ourselves and making sure that we make those changes. And all of us have to see how we contribute toward this social revolution, which will slowly and truly change our society.
Please.
Would you agree that the role models in our society, such as our president, with the typical shower on his head and his actions as a countler, he's amongst others in our role model scenario, are set to be a good example in terms of the Constitution?
You're absolutely right. I think that our role models, at that, not only at the level of Nkandla and corruption and so on, but our role models in relation to racism and sexism, in relation to true non-racialism and true non-sexism, are also bad. I mean, you look at how often have you heard even our parliamentarians. I made an offer, by the way, to Parliament when I retired as a judge to conduct some courses on the Bill of Rights. Never heard from them. But But the point is that even our parliamentarians, there was a time in the past 5 or 10 years of our democracy, our parliamentarians too, because it was new and fresh, were talking what I might call the Bill of Rights language more. Now, our government and our parliament don't speak the Bill of Rights language. You watch the President's State of the Nation address. I've been looking at them closely for the past few years. How many of them are about truly trying to change these value systems? How many of them recognize these values as being important? They actually don't, and that's why there's a huge problem out there. How many of the councils of our universities know the Bill of Rights? How many of the lecturers at the University of Cape Town, you think, have read the Bill of Rights and internalized its values? It's a simple document. It's a straightforward document, and yet we've got to start perpetuating those values. We've got to make sure that people do these things. Please.
In many ways, people respond better to what they see on media and social media than parliamentarians. Well, how do you feel media is portraying those values, and is it getting better or worse?
I think that we are getting better. I think we are getting better. I think it's a good thing when we get worse. Sometimes it's a good thing when some people on social media make racist comments and so on, because I generally think I would rather have those racist comments out there in the open than being driven underground, so that we begin to understand what truly is happening. Well, at least you know the problem and you can work at it. So I am quite pleased about the way in which social media is actually exposing the problem so that we actually understand it better and make it work. But again, if for example, all of us started blogs aimed at achieving that result, we achieve a great deal. And these are the small things that we can actually do. And I agree that participating in social media, which I think I'm too old to do now, is one way in which to change the hearts and minds of people. Yes?
Given what you said about how you think that in some ways when people make these racist...
Sorry, you have to go louder than that.
Sorry, given that you've said that in some ways when people make overtly racist statements on social media, it's a positive thing because, you know, as you say, you can identify the problem and you know what you're dealing with. What is your personal opinion on the notion of bringing to force a hate crimes act or a hate speech act? Do you think that could actually have a negative effect as opposed to a positive effect, because it would drive people underground for the wrong reasons?
I actually think that hate crimes are important to create the right atmosphere. But my thinking, as I said, is that prosecution and sentencing is not the answer. In the same way as for example, high sentences for rape have not reduced rape by itself. So what you need is, apart from sending the message out there that our society will not tolerate these things and will declare it a crime, one needs more than that. One needs to develop a culture. And that applies not only to hate crime, but in my view, that applies to the commission of every crime. We've got to have a culture of non-corruption, a culture of anti-corruption, a culture in which if we had a true culture in which women were truly respected, our rapes would go down much more than they would if you simply criminalize them. So while I'm happy about criminalization, I think that we are lulled into a false sense of security by beginning to think that criminalization itself does the trick. Again, it's the same problem about the law must do it, others must do it, judges must do it. We don't stop to ask the question, what can we do about it?
Further questions? Please.
perhaps at high school level and that. And I've always been quite surprised that young people who come from a different generation, post-apartheid generation, how they still struggle to grapple with human rights, and even the Bill of Rights as being law, as opposed to how they perceive what crime is. So it sort of seems to be a soft, it's not nice to make sexist comments or racist comments, but they can't relate to it as being anything unlawful. With actually something like crime, like hurting somebody physically, they would see. And I don't know how one changes that culture.
Yeah, I think that people experience a block. I really think that all you need to do, and all of you can start tonight actually, just read paragraphs 1 to 39. Internalize those things. See in a common sense way their relationship to each other, and you will soon see that it is not a document for lawyers. It is really a humane document which each of us can understand. People have developed, in my view, a block towards it in their own minds because they think, well, these are legal documents meant for lawyers. Just read it. Don't forget about parliament and cooperative governance and so on. Just read paragraphs 1 to 36 or 37. Leave 38 and 39 too. It can get a bit complicated for you. It's about 10 pages. Read it, internalize it, make something of it for yourself.
Further, or whilst people are thinking, can I just ask you,
Yeah.
in the light, well, how you respond to this attack? You've hinted at it, the attack that we now get on the Constitution, that it's a Eurocentric document which was a messy compromise and effectively represented the Senate by the ANC government to the old ancient regime, and actually we've got to start all over again.
Yeah, I've responded to it at a number of fora already,
Yeah.
and my approach is that there is no inconsistency. Of course, the criticism is that Ubuntu is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. That's probably right as a criticism, but that was straightforwardly an omission. I think if anybody had suggested the inclusion of the term Ubuntu there, it would have been in the new Constitution. There was no problem. But in my view, there is absolutely no contradiction between, except to the extent that customary values are sexist and divisive and tribalist in the sense also of being racist, except if you leave those things out completely, there is no real difference between the idea of the importance of society as a whole as distinct from the overall importance of freedom. See, our Constitution emphasizes not only freedom, it emphasizes dignity, equality, and freedom, and we've got to assess a balance. And no one has yet been able to point to the way in which these values, as set out in the Constitution, are actually inconsistent with the positive elements of customary law, the collective and communal elements of societal existence in a customary setting. There is nothing in our Constitution which is different from that. But of course, there is another problem. There is a young African elite, men in particular, who I've met in KwaZulu-Natal. I don't know whether they exist in Cape Town, but they've expressed their views at conferences too. There are difficulties with young people about decisions in cases like Bear, for example, because they say these are our customary values. There was a case in which the Constitutional Court decided that a community should have could have, at its own decision, its own woman chief. There are many, many people in customary society, even young people, even lawyers, law students, who would actually disagree with that. And that is because sexism is so ingrained. I've had 25, 30-year-old young lawyers say to me that we in the African community, we understand the values of women. We really do. We really think they are very important. But we must actually have the final say. And we give the women all the say they want, but in the end, we, the men, we must decide it. But it's not only African people. There's many a white man who thinks that, make no mistake, and many an Indian man and many a colored man who would think that in his heart of hearts, and we must learn to face this reality.
Yes, sir, at the back, and then I'll come to you. Yes.
This paragraph here in chapter 5 that says, the President must uphold, defend and respect the Constitution. Now, I've got a feeling that our President doesn't do that. And somehow or other, nobody's got the guts to get up and say, you know, this is not okay. You're not fulfilling your job.
Well, the problem is bigger than that, because you see, to uphold, protect, and respect the Constitution, you've got to understand it. You've got to internalize it. So I don't think many people do internalize it. I don't think many I don't think even ministers and government people and parliamentarians, when they take this oath, know what it means. And there is an interesting conflict, I think, a potential conflict. Not telling Dennis how to decide the case if it comes before him, but there is an interesting conflict between adopting the Western concept of party politics, which is the idea of the chief whip and people being bound by what the political party decides in terms of the way they vote and so on the one hand, and the oath which people take in Parliament on the other. And a very interesting question arises. What if the way in which you are required to vote by your party whip, and that's what they are called still, whips, we still retain the term, you're required to vote in a particular way, and your conscience tells you that that is not the way in which you should vote because you'll be acting contrary to the Constitution. How do you uphold, respect, and protect the Constitution? That's an important thing to bear in mind. But the more important thing is that those who are supposed to uphold and respect and protect the Constitution ought at least to understand its values and internalize them. And I think that's where the problem really lies. And people should begin to understand what that problem is and work it through.
Yes, please. I thought there was... please carry on.
Other than the judges in the Constitutional Court understanding the Constitution, I would assume that the judges below the Constitutional Court also understand the Constitution.
Look, there are two kinds of judges. Sorry.
You just use the words conflict and so on. Is there not a conflictual role in a judge below the Constitutional Court?
Yeah.
Having to interpret the law and the intention of the law in front of you in black and white versus having to interpret that law in the light of the constitutional value?
Yeah, you raise a very, very interesting question. So the legal profession is a conservative one. The Constitution was brought into our structure, and it ought to impact on every level and every aspect of our society. It doesn't because hard-nosed lawyers who make money and who help other people make money through decisions in contract and delict and so on, have not begun to internalize the Constitution. So our Constitution says that the spirit, purport, and objects of the Constitution are absolutely important in determining any case, and that has to be taken into account. The problem is that people who practice law don't necessarily believe this, with the result that you quite often find that cases are argued in the High Court and in the Supreme Court of Appeal sometimes without constitutional issues being raised by lawyers at all. So lawyers don't raise them, the judges don't think about them, and the cases come to the Constitutional Court for the first time. And now, because the shoe pinches and because they have lost their cases before, they raise constitutional issues for the first time. And our court have consistently said that we will not. I wrote a minority judgment to say unless we start considering them, even if they come to us for the first time, at some stage we're never going to get there, but we don't consider it. And that's why that is another problem in our society, because lawyers don't necessarily see the importance of the Constitution to ensuring fairness of contract, of ensuring rules which are fair overall, and how the law of contract too has to comply with the Constitution. And because lawyers don't think about this often, and because judges in our country have become accustomed to deciding cases in terms of what lawyers raise before them, because that is the system we have. In our country, cases are raised, arguments are raised, and by and large, judges decide questions in terms of the argument presented to them. Very seldom do you get judges who go the other way. But there is another problem. There are two kinds of judges in our country. All of them, obviously, need to uphold, respect, and protect the Constitution, and they would do so. But it depends on which side of or how you were born, in a sense. Some of us are naturally conservative, and there are many judges in our country too who are naturally conservative, who take a positivist view of the law and interpret it for what it means. And yet there are others who do it in a slightly different way and are less conservative about the letter of the law and are more interested in developing value systems. And I would say that, without mentioning any names, that the judges in South Africa before 1994 who belonged to that category probably were about 1 or 2%. And I would say, I'm happy to say that the judges who belong to that category in this country today, in my view, probably amount to 30 or 40%. I know that Dennis would agree with that. I think Dennis certainly belongs in that category. But I think we've progressed from 1 or 2% of judges to 30, 40% of our judges who are prepared to be creative and so on and so on. And that process should continue.
One final question, anybody? Yes, please, sir.
Does politics play a part in the appointment of constitutional court judges?
Did you hear that?
So
Do politics play a role in the appointment of constitutional court judges?
yes, they do. And you see, because it is precisely because the role of the Constitutional Court judge includes making decisions on political policy questions in relation to adjudicating on conduct that arises out of those political policy decisions, that the Constitution maker came to the conclusion that there should be a political input into the appointment of judges. So the way in which Constitutional Court judges are appointed, for those of you who don't know, it's quite an interesting procedure, which is that firstly, the Judicial Services Commission consists of a large number of politicians, but only half the politicians there from members of parliament and so on are supposed to be from the ruling party. But if you add the Minister of Justice and so on, the balance shifts quite considerably. And so firstly, there are a large number of politicians in that process, in